Thank you. So for many colleagues, you'll be familiar with the format of these sessions. We've been working through for the past couple of months on the end-to-end process of pharmacovigilance, and now we reach the critical part around benefit risk assessment. And I'll be joined today by my colleague Alison Banner-Simpson, who's a senior scientific assessor in our benefit risk management group and has had a fairly long career with the MHRA so far in investigating a large number of pharmacovigilance issues. So she brings a lot of experience to this session today. Next slide, please. As usual, we're joined by colleagues across the African Union, predominantly in the 4 countries that we're working most closely with, in Ghana, Nigeria, Ethiopia and South Africa, but also stakeholders from other organisations across the African Union. And you're all most welcome. Next slide, please. As a reminder, by way of introduction, my name is Mick Foy. I'm head of pharmacovigilance strategy at the MHRA, and pleased to lead these sessions over the past few months and into the next couple of months. As a reminder, our organisation is the UK regulator for medicines and medical devices, and we undertake all of the work from licensing, post-licensing, inspection and enforcement. Next slide, please. Won't dwell on this. It's just to set out that we are a government body, part of the UK's Department of Health and Social Care, largely based in London, with our National Institute for Biologic Standards and Control in Hertfordshire, which is just outside of London. Next slide, please. I'm always very keen to share with the audience that the MHRA's vision is to protect and improve the health of millions of people through our effective regulation of medicines and medical devices. And when we say millions of people, obviously our primary concern is within the UK and for UK citizens, but we absolutely recognise that medicines regulation, in particular pharmacovigilance, is a global issue, and we're very keen to share our knowledge and experience and work with others acquiring their knowledge and experience as well around the globe, so that we can truly protect and improve the health of millions of people within and outside of the UK. Next slide, please. So as I said, we are now in module 3 of our training package. We will start today with risk assessment, and throughout the course of the month, we'll move into looking at the role of the risk management plan, of the periodic safety update reports, the important role that pharmacoepidemiology plays in pharmacovigilance, and the bearing that has on regulatory decision making. So as you can see, this training package has 5 modules and really is a building blocks throughout. So we started with data collection, and then from that data, how we identify signals. And then when we identify a signal, now we're moving into how we undertake the benefit risk assessment of those signals. And then next month, we'll move into how those benefit risk assessment decisions are communicated. And then lastly, in around May time, we'll be looking at the role of how we tap into expert committees, expert advisory committees to strengthen the role of the regulators. Next slide, please. So here you will see just the more granular breakdown of module 3. As I said, today is we'll be looking at risk assessment, then we'll move on to RMPs, PSURs and epidemiology over the course of this month. Make a note of those dates for your diary, please. You'd be most welcome to rejoin us. Next slide, please. So the aims of Module 3, we'll start today with providing an overview of how risk assessment is carried out. Then we'll move into the understanding of risk management plans, risk minimization, and we will have, as always, through these sessions, a special look at considerations around vaccines, given the situation that we find ourselves in today. Then we'll move on to the key principles of PSURs, the periodic safety update reports, and then, as mentioned, we'll outline the role of pharmacoepidemiology in the process of pharmacovigilance and how we look at different data sources when undertaking benefit risk assessment. And also, as mentioned, then we'll finish this module with an understanding of the different regulatory options, how we seek advice and how we implement that advice and that regulatory decision. Next slide, please. As a reminder, we're using Zoom, and hopefully you'll be familiar with the functions, but we have a chat function, and we'd ask you only to use this, the chat box for raising issues around functionality or any technical issues with the running of the webinar, but use the Q&A box for submitting questions. That we always leave hopefully plenty of time at the end of these for questions and answers. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We always have a number of raised hands throughout these sessions. Unfortunately, we are unable to address the raised hand. We cannot unmute you to ask a question. So please, if you wanted to raise your hand, bear that in mind and use the Q&A box, please. Next slide, please. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ali Banner-Simpson, who, as I said, is a senior scientific assessor in our benefit risk management group. And Ali's now going to take you through that introduction to risk assessment. Ali, over to you.
Thank you, Mick. So good morning, everybody. My name is Ali Banner-Simpson. As Mick has said, I've worked at the MHRA since 2009. And prior to that, I was a nurse for 20 years. So as you can imagine, health and public health has been a constant and important aspect of my life. And I'm delighted to speak to you today. Thank you. First slide, please. So I'm going to give a high-level overview of how risk assessment is carried out, and broadly it will follow the structure in the slide. So we'll talk about considerations, examining the data, and also outcomes. Next slide, please. So assessment work is an investigative, involves detective work and problem solving. It's important to plan and accumulate evidence so that the analysis of the data can be the best currently available. It's rarely straightforward, so judgment will be involved, and this is where training and experience can really add value. Once the assessment has been carried out, it's equally important to decide on an outcome which will mitigate risk and, of course, will not cause unintended harmful consequences. Throughout the entire procedure, it's essential to consider communication. So whether that's consultation with the public or with healthcare professionals as you're gathering the data, whether it's seeking expert advice, and of course, very importantly, communication of the outcome of your assessment is clearly essential. Next slide, please. So I'm talking about risk assessment today, but we need to put this into context in that risk assessment is always seen in the context of benefit. It may be at population level in terms of vaccine, or it might be individual in terms of drugs or devices. And low benefits and efficacy of a drug compared with another treatment for the same disease process will obviously increase our sensitivity to risk. But in doing our risk assessment, normally we have a benefit profile that we can examine it against. Next slide, please. So benefits may relate to many different kind of aspects. I won't go through the whole slides, we can see them outlined here. To pick up prevention, as that's topical. Vaccines are an obvious example. They're unique in being given to a healthy population, or at least a demographically extremely variable population. So they present their own challenges in terms of risk assessment. But of course, we've got other forms of benefits such as cures, control of symptoms, and interestingly, modifications of surrogate markers, which are indicative of risk of a certain type of disease. So a good example of these would be statins, lowering cholesterol and having a very, very major impact on reduction of cardiovascular disease. Next slide, please. So this is quite a busy slide, but I think it's good to reflect on the perception that risk affects perception of how risk is affected by the perception of the person involved. So one of our roles as regulators is to monitor and challenge potential biases and sources of biases, and it helps us to gain an understanding of where a potential bias has come from. So if I just talk about maybe the patient box, so patients might be very influenced by social media. So of course, that could lead to either take up of vaccines or in many cases, vaccine hesitancy. So it's good to know that of kind of the influences that are influencing your public. So in healthcare professionals, for example, may be influenced if they see a drug as established use and the safety is already well recognized. And pharmaceutical companies may be influenced maybe by sales not to define risks, or provide good quality data so that risks can be assessed. So we need to be aware of all these kind of influence and our perceptions as well as regulators to make sure that really we can make the best risk assessment as possible. Next slide, please. So once a risk has been identified, it may help to have an awareness of where it's come from. Was it a patient or patients? Does a patient consultation need to take place? Do you need to have discussions with professional medical bodies if it comes from a healthcare professional query? So all the time in our mind, we will have an idea of what potentially the public health impact will be. That's a very important point. And whether it's a drug or a vaccine or a device will slightly modify the way the assessment takes place. Next slide, please. And we need to have an idea also of the balance of the community benefits versus the individual risk and how many people are effective. So clearly, it might be a very rare treatment, a very rare risk, which is related to a very large treatment effect, and that will have an influence on our decision-making process. The speed and, sorry, next slide, please. The speed and detailed consideration of risk assessment will depend on the seriousness of the suspected risk. So clearly risks with severe disability or death merit more urgent risk assessment, and this needs to be estimated from the outset. Next slide, please. So timescales for the assessment need to be mapped out. And of course, there's a balance between reacting urgently or more slowly to an issue. So you need to consider perhaps, are you reacting too quickly before all the evidence has been considered? Or are you taking your time to gather all the information, take a bit of a slower approach and maybe widening the scope of your assessment? So it would really depend on what the risk is, and this will change each time, but it's very good to try and factor in timescales and how urgently you need to conduct the assessment. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give an example here. So dangers of early interpretation of data. This is obviously very current with vaccines and with amazing efforts that scientists have managed to achieve in getting vaccines onto the forum in such a short space of time. But with that have come issues. So we get preprint research papers which are not peer reviewed being released. We also see release of interim results, which was not normal prior to this pandemic. The press are usually involved with data prior to vaccine approval. So the data is not final, and potential risks that are raised are not always proven at this point. And this can cause knock-on effects and large consequences. So if we take the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, it was mooted that maybe it wasn't effective over 65s because it hadn't been studied largely in that population. And a German newspaper quoted that AstraZeneca vaccine was only 8% effective. It turns out that they had spoken to the government and there'd been a misquote of data, and the 8% was actually the percentage of people over 65 in the study, not the effectiveness of the drug. And so the consequence of this was very widespread. 4 out of 5 of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines reportedly delivered to EU countries are yet to be used, and Angela Merkel has admitted there is an acceptance problem among Europeans being offered this jab. Next slide, please. So to counteract that, it's not all negative, of course, because we do get a positive side from the press, and the Ghanaian president, whose name I will not attempt to pronounce, on Monday became the world's first recipient of coronavirus vaccine from COVAX, which was very exciting news. And of course, this has an influence. And then we have also responsible reporting and more considered reporting maybe, and we get the efficacy data out there. So, you know, The Guardian reported a study this week saying that both Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines are about 80% effective at preventing hospitalization, which is extremely encouraging news. Next slide, please. So in terms of your at-risk population, we know that clinical trials are conducted in healthy volunteers. Usually no pregnant women, for ethical reasons, are placed in the trials, and don't tend to have studies of children and the elderly for similar reasons. So it's interesting to see how and question how extensively the product has been studied in your particular population, and how the risks of that subpopulation will be affected by this. So for instance, how severe is the disease burden? Is it potentially made worse by the drug? For example, patients with HIV, TB, or immunocompromised patients, are they at greater risk of lack of efficacy for vaccines? And as going forward, we are constantly monitoring these kind of things all the time. And in terms of pregnancy, of course, that's another wide issue. I think I'll talk a bit about that a bit later on. But as you can see, it's very valuable to kind of know the population that you're looking at. Next slide, please. So in conducting your assessment, you need to consider all the relevant data. And of course, you won't have all the data at your fingertips, and every single assessment is different in terms of the data that you can get. So you might have spontaneous data from adverse drug reactions, reports into a pharmacovigilance database. There might be PSURs and safety reviews that you can look at to see whether your particular risk is indicated there. There might be studies, observational studies from real world data, which will be more helpful than clinical trial data in some cases for certain subpopulations. And of course, you have the clinical trial data itself. You can get an idea about safety from the preclinical studies, for instance, and also the randomized phase 3 studies. Next slide, please. So where do I start? Well, first of all, understanding the product is key. So you have a product information leaflet with the information set out. So are there similar side terms listed as side effects as the risk that you're investigating? Is there a warning or a contraindication? Do you look at potential drug-related mechanisms? Is this risk identified in the same class of drugs, but not particularly for the drug that you're looking at? So that would all be important information to gather. There may or may not be a risk management plan. Often the older products don't have a risk management plan. But if there is one, it's a very useful source of information to find out what risks are seen as potential and where the missing information actually is, and has it previously been discussed. You'll be able to access easily the preclinical findings, which we'll see with underline whether there's biological plausibility to your risk. And there will be information about the randomized control data, so the endpoints in the study. Was the study just really for efficacy and not really powered for a safety issue? What is the risk that you're looking at in a certain population? Was that population excluded, or was the size of the trial quite small? Periodic safety reports also contain this sort of information, and it lets you know whereabouts in the life cycle the product is, if it's an established product, and how many reports there've been and what signals have been brought up. And that will be summarized in those reports, and it will be very useful for you to look at if they're available. Next slide, please. So as well as that, we also need to know what the nature of the risk is. So is it associated with a certain disease? And does that disease carry with it certain comorbidities, which might change the way the risk that you are looking at is regarded? If possible, try and find out the background rate of the risk in that population. And sometimes this information is available from observational studies and from the risk management plan. It's useful to look at clinical guidelines and then whether in fact the risk is in context of off-label use. In terms of regulatory outputs, the risk or the issue might have been looked at elsewhere in other domains, in other competent authorities, and this can collaboration between different regulators can help tremendously in the larger risks that we are looking at. There may be published information, published case series that you can look at. And there also may be a post-authorization safety study in progress, and I suggested that if that is the case and it's likely to finish soon, then it might be relevant to wait and do your assessment once the results of that study have been published. In terms of domestic health and social measures, what is the profile of the drug or vaccine, and how does this relate to the risk? You might need to find out what the professional bodies feel and used in clinical practice. And it's also quite important to know what the press interest is around this, and that will also kind of foster how quickly you look at the risk. Next slide, please. So that looks all very ominous because there's lots of information, and so, not all that information will be available, and not all risk assessments will need to have a very, very extensive review. So I wanted to emphasize that at this point. We need to take a pragmatic approach according to resource. Again, bringing the example of vaccines, the data coming in at the moment is extensive, and in terms of the less serious risk, we've definitely taken a pragmatic approach, triaging them. The companies put in safety updates, and if they say, look, from a number perspective, these non-serious and maybe expected risks seem to be an issue, we'll like to put them on the product label, then we go along with that. We don't bother with the review. What we would do is concentrate on the things that are more serious and may have more impact. Thank you. Next slide, please. So of course, some risks need more detailed information, and what you really need to find out is what the strength of evidence is, and if it's preventable, predictable, or reversible, because that will have a big impact on your outcome and what you do about the risk. So I'm not going to go into this into too much detail. This is, sorry, the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. The strength of evidence, because clearly, sorry, back one slide. Sorry, I think there might be have a pause. Yes, yes. So clearly there are issues and pros and cons from randomized control trials, and from observational data and from spontaneous data, and of course all the other forms of data that you're looking at, and having an awareness of this so that you can weigh up the evidence is key. We will be doing a module on pharmacoepidemiology, so as you can see, the things are outlined on this slide, and they would be taken into consideration. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more about looking at the strength of the evidence. We need to balance the evidence for and against causality, explaining the weight of each piece of key evidence according to the overall hierarchy of evidence, with reference to statistical significance and qualitative assessment. So we would kind of discuss the reasons or the possible reasons for inconsistencies within the data, the strengths and limitations of that data, differences in study populations, these kinds of things. In terms of adverse event reporting, they can be incomplete, can be poor case definitions in many cases, or inadequate monitoring or follow-up, which can frustrate a little bit the information that you have and the evidence that you can present. Next slide, please. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because Claire covered this in the previous session, causality, but I thought it was interesting to have all the slides together if you were wanting these slides as reference, because all these factors are taken into consideration when we make a causal estimation of whether there is a risk is attributed to a certain drug. Next slide, please. So in assessing the public health impact, we do have to have some sort of quantitative data. So if the risk has been raised in terms of a signal in the pharmacovigilance database, we'll have an idea about disproportionality. And there are caveats to that, we know, but it will give us an idea in relation to other drugs and other drugs within the same class, whether the risk is elevated. We're also able to look at reports of similar terms, because if we have similar terms also reported, this might confer that a risk is actually there. So we're interested in absolute increased risk of a treatment versus no treatment or an alternative treatment, so weigh up the balance. Next slide, please. So absolute risk is the risk of developing disease over a period of time. Risk may not be constant over time, may be greatest soon after exposure, such as anaphylactic reactions, or it may be some relatively constant risk, such as hepatotoxicity. I've given an example there to show you the difference between prevalence, incidence, and that these things are essential in interpreting particularly published literature reports, but also in terms of having an idea in our minds about prevalent incidents that are not actually reported figures as such. We can use that on a day-to-day basis. So, for instance, we can look at say the prevalence of COVID-19 in various at-risk groups and their risk factors that are associated with that, so that we know, for instance, that pregnant women are more at risk, or their babies are more at risk of hospitalization than non-COVID pregnant patients. So this can kind of feed into how we look at vaccines and whether they should be given to pregnant women. And I know that this is not at the moment completely decided. In terms of the US, they give the vaccines in pregnant women. At the moment in the UK, we're waiting for more data, and we use an individual risk assessment from the medics involved, whether they think that patients at risk should be given. So there is a risk that the healthcare professionals who are pregnant, who have greater exposure, would benefit from the vaccine more than others, for example. Next slide, please. So relative risk compares the risk of two different groups, and it's actually a little bit more difficult to understand when we're communicating with patients sometimes. So we like to look at absolute or attributable risk, because it's kind of easier to understand. So for instance, for an example of this, the number of additional cases due to the drug as opposed to background incidence. So if we look at the contraceptive pill, the risk of venous thromboembolism in oral contraceptive is about 0.06 per 100 pill years. And that is significantly lower than the rate of 0.2 per 100 years of at risk during pregnancy and during the postpartum period. So it's important for patients to be aware of the practical risk that they are conferring. Thank you. Next slide. So in our risk assessment, we look also at the qualitative data, and this is interesting in terms of what the therapeutic context is, whether patients are actually using the product properly. Do they know how to use it? Do the healthcare professionals, are they using the product properly? Are they prescribing it as indicated, or is it being used as off-label, and is this increasing the risk for certain populations? We look at time to onset and whether there is a resolve of issues once the drug is stopped, or once the drug is restarted or re-challenged, do the issues come back? That gives us quite strong evidence about the risk. And of course, I've said before, severity and outcome is extremely important, and this will really alter our judgment in what we do about it. To a background, we need to look at confounding factors and risk factors, of course, and whether multiple polypharmacy is a factor in causing things with a compound risk of one drug on top of another. Next slide, please. So in the analysis of spontaneous reporting, there are a few pointers. I'm not going to talk too long about this because we've had lectures on causality assessment, but these are a few pointers to look at. Beware of underlying disease progression, because sometimes the disease under treatment is high mortality, or if the patient is taking a particular pill because they're not responding to the first and second line treatments, they are more severe, and they might be just having an issue because of their disease and not because of the drug itself and the way that drug is used in particular populations. So that needs to be borne into consideration. Serious adverse events may be acceptable if the benefits are greater, or if there are no alternative treatment options, of course. We don't always have alternative options that can be given. There may be a case for letting the treatment still be given to the population if we can provide additional education, additional risk minimisation measures, patient alert cards, support of greater monitoring, things like this, so that patients can still benefit from treatment. Of course, some risks are harder to assess. Some have a very sort of slow and gradual onset, so they're not immediately obvious. There's no pinpointing the time that they start. Some you can't re-challenge. If someone's had severe depression, for example, you would not want to give them that drug again in case they had such a severe reaction. And some take such a long time to materialize that it's difficult to attribute it to the cause of the drug, because there are lots of confounding factors in between. So the example here is depression, but we can also think about cancers as well. It's sometimes very difficult for these things. And of course, these sorts of things are not picked up in clinical trials, because clinical trials tend to be short term, and they tend to be of smaller population. So this is where post-marketing risk assessment really comes into fore. Another point is that off-label use can highlight important issues, and if there's a deterioration of an existing condition plus a close temporal relationship, that may add weight to the biological plausibility of that risk being conferred to that drug. So that's a kind of like an opposing point to the point one. But these are all good things to have in mind. Next slide, please. So after you've done your assessment, you obviously, after you've done your assessment, you need to write a written report to kind of summarize what you've found. And this is a structure really taken from the CIOM's benefit risk advice, which I have put a link to on the references. It's very useful. And it helps to kind of lay out what's the essential things to put down. So the background and description of the drug, how it's used, the indication, a little bit about its history of when it was licensed. Identifying the issue, summarizing what that is, presenting the data of the weight of evidence, and discussing very pinpointing the discussion around how preventable the risk is, how predictable it is, and how reversible it is. How does it relate to the safety profile that we already know? So we already have an idea of the benefit of the risk of the product, of course, especially if it's an established product. And so, is there an excess instance of this risk occurring? Is this what we'd expect, or is there an increase in frequency? Is there something that's different that we can act upon to mitigate this risk? So clearly, judgment is a big factor, and proportionality is too, because going back to the diagram about where you are and how you evaluate risk, I would look at myself, for instance, and in terms of being proportionate, because I was an intensive care nurse, and I've been around ill health, I suppose, for a long period of time. I know that I am quite risk averse, and that I sometimes have to think, right, what is important for the patient? Am I being too reactive to this? And that's where discussion with colleagues with all different experiences, and just getting expert advice from clinical professional bodies and researchers is really, really helpful when you can get that. So in terms of deciding what to do, you can list all the appropriate options, consider pros and cons, and then also consider the potential consequences, because what you don't want to do is to say this risk is occurring and you absolutely have a rebound effect of something else that happens because of this. So that needs to be really importantly discussed and considered. So I'm not going to talk too much about regulatory options, because we do have a whole module on that, but basically we don't always have to act, and that as well is valid, because we can investigate a risk and say we've looked at the evidence. At the moment, we don't think there is enough evidence for there to be a risk, and you can still continue taking this drug, which is obviously very helpful. So it's not always about putting warnings on the product information or restricting use, but of course we can do things like increase monitoring, increase awareness from healthcare professionals. I mean, at the very last resort, we would take something off the market, but in between time, we would try and investigate whether we can use extra risk minimization materials to mitigate the risk. And of course, we can always take the action to gather more data and to elicit studies to look at the risk concerned. Next slide, please. So we come to my last slide. You might be glad to know quite a lot of things covered, but I would like to say importantly, we need to consider implementation and communication of the key messages, and actually it's good to have them in mind throughout, so that those communications can be focused and targeted in the right areas, and that you're prepared in case there is an explosion in the press, for example. So it goes without saying that we need expert judgment leading to a quality output, but communication is the most essential part of the process. We need to stress that more than anything, because we don't want to do an assessment and completely waste our time by not actually getting that message over to the people that we need to get that message over to. And equally, evaluating the effectiveness and the impact of your actions is very, very important. So considering whether there was sufficient communication, what the patient experience has been, and whether the risk has been mitigated, and whether clinical outcomes have improved as a result of the things that you've put in place. So I'd like to finish there, and I'd like to say thank you very much for the opportunity for speaking to you, and I'm very happy to take questions later if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. Really did cover a wealth of issues there. I'd encourage colleagues to submit questions to the Q&A box. There are none at the minute. So this could turn into a fireside chat between us both, Ali. But I did note down a couple of things as you were going through that might be worth just picking up on. You talked about perceptions of risk from different stakeholder groups. And you know, I think where we are at the minute with vaccines, that's a key issue for us. When we are considering a signal that may have come through spontaneous reports, how do we weigh up the perception of risk from, let's say, an immunization program or a government policy that says we need to get the vaccine out very quickly, and you know, to combat this this sort of national emergency, against the perception of risk from maybe more vaccine hesitant folk who are wary about, you know, side effects and so on. How do we balance that in terms of, you know, how we communicate and how we judge the issues that are coming through the door?
Yes, well, obviously proactive communication is very important, but what we need to demonstrate is that we are taking all the risks seriously and that we're actively monitoring the data. So in terms of vaccines, of course, we do active surveillance, and we publish, and we are transparent, and we publish the data that we have received. So in terms of vaccines, we've received a lot of reports, but importantly, when we publish that data, we have to consider the way in which we publish that. So we don't, you know, we don't want to put a top line of, oh, we've had X amount of deaths, because, you know, when you're vaccinating millions of people, there will be incidental events that happen. So you present the data in a considered way, and allowing the patient to see the benefit of it. And it's so all, you know, this benefit and risk is also always put together in one conversation, because clearly in societies where the COVID is a major problem, and in subpopulations where it's a major problem, we've seen the uptake of vaccines in our over 80-year-olds extremely high, because their risk is massive, whereas the young people is more of an issue. And I think we need to find proactive ways of tackling misinformation on social media as well. But as regulators, we are transparent, and we're serious about looking at every single risk. And we have adverse events of special interest that we concentrate on, and we've put quite a lot of resource into that, and we also collaborate with other people globally. So yes, I hope I've answered your question. I think I might have rambled a bit, but
No, absolutely. I think what we're seeing at the moment, and we've shared this, information with colleagues in these sessions before, and it kind of comes to your point around be proportionate as well. But when we are looking at a volume of reporting that is unprecedented, it would be quite easy, I think, you tell me, to look at the volume of cases and think that something serious is really going on with these vaccines, because we're experiencing a reporting rate that we have not experienced previously. What's the temptation there to kind of think every case is a signal that is a risk issue that needs regulatory intervention?
So when you're looking at things on a day-by-day basis and the reports are coming in, you're trying to look at it on an individual case basis. As you say, it's very tempting to say, well, that looks like a really strong case. But what we need to do is measure that against other active surveillance measures. So we need to kind of look at the background rate. So for instance, looking at the rate of picking something out of the air, neurological disorders that might be coming up, or disease processes which might have a flare up. If we can look at the back at our drug safety database plus our CRPD databases, we can see what the background is, what's expected for that population, what's the rate, and what do we actually have. And when we get to disproportionality, then we look at it as we go along. But of course, when we get a disproportionality, then we see more that there's a likelihood of a signal taking place, and we ask for expert advice. So we have like independent adjudicators on a lot of these things, because we aren't all experts in everything, of course. So for instance, we have neurologists that are looking specifically at the Guillain-Barré syndrome reports, and the adverse events of special interest. We get cardiologists in to talk about various stuff as well. So we're having lots of meetings with experts, and we're getting all the studies coming in too, to have a look at that information, to foster it, so that we have a measured approach, and that we don't just shoot from the hip and say, oh my gosh, I think there might be something going on here. And also we do have a wealth of experience, of course, with other vaccines. So we can look at what's happened in other vaccines and say, actually, the likelihood of this being an issue might be occurring, because we've seen that in other vaccines. So yes, it's a considered approach, and it's I'd say a multi-country approach, and also a multidisciplinary approach. Yeah.
And I guess as we see the same vaccines and other vaccines being rolled out in other countries, we know the COVAX deliveries have been happening over the last week and continue.
Yeah, amazing.
We will see more evidence of from other settings as well, and we'll be able to bear that in mind when doing our own risk assessments.
Yeah, I think that's particularly the case from pregnancy, because of course the rollout of the vaccines was so fast that pregnant women, it was decided they weren't going to study pregnant women in the trials. Now I think Pfizer have just started to study now, but it's quite late in the day. It's a year down the line essentially. But in the US, they've been receiving vaccines, so we kind of have to look at that data. We can draw that data. We can draw the preclinical data from all the vaccines. It doesn't look like there's an issue in pregnancy. So we need, that will foster our kind of assessment of the risk. And of course, with these trials that have, taken place on thousands and thousands of individuals, even though that wasn't meant to be given to pregnant people during trials, there obviously were some patients that were pregnant. So we can get the data of that. But of course, with these kind of outcomes, it takes a long time for the pregnancy to develop and for you to get the data. So it is a sort of, watching space by space. And it's a changing pattern. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess an example of that sort of in the other direction would be maybe, I think you highlighted the European position with the AstraZeneca vaccine. I think we're seeing a change in that position based upon the evidence coming out of the UK in terms of efficacy in the elderly. They're reconsidering their position on the over 65s, for example.
Yes, exactly. I mean, as I said, I think it was 8% of patients in the elderly was studied originally in the trial, but it was felt that this data could be extrapolated. There wouldn't be really any reason why it wouldn't be unsafe, and the data that shown was reassuring. So in the UK, we rolled it out and decided that was the way to go, and the EMA agreed. But there were various individual member states that said no, they didn't think it was safe. And of course, there was a media storm. But now we've got more data that's come out of the UK, because we have done this rollout and we have given it to millions of patients. That is very, very reassuring. And so, you know, that's a real time example of how we can, you know, counteract some of the concern about risk by looking at the real world data.
Yeah, and you know, as you say, it's an ever evolving situation, and I'm sure we'll all adjust as we see new evidence coming from other settings and so on. We look forward to that. There have been some questions come in to the Q&A box. So Annaline Nell says, excellent overview, thank you. Implementation of key messages. How do you determine the platform to reach the relevant public platform? Well, there will be a session on risk communication, a whole module around risk communication. But Ali, do you want to touch on some of the tools that we use, some of the platforms that we use?
Yes, absolutely. And as I said, communication is really, really important. We have drug safety update, which goes out to healthcare professionals, where we can publish and make healthcare professionals aware. We can confer with professional bodies to see which particular healthcare professionals need to be targeted and what their input is. In terms of vaccine, you know, I guess for communication on social media networks to sort of stop or help stop vaccine hesitancy is important. I'm not sure we do that too actively in the UK, but when I was participating with colleagues in India, there was prior to the COVID problem, there was vaccine hesitancy in a particular group of population in India, and they reached out via social media in a different language via young children who were very, very keen to take up the vaccine, and that was amazingly successful. So there are all sorts of different tools that you can use. We sometimes send out letters to, and we put media campaigns, and I guess that will all depend on the risk that we see, and also the media storm, because you know, sometimes it's very important. Like our head June Rain has been on national television to say we have looked at the safety of these vaccines, we are happy, we have assessed it, we are happy to, and that is very, very, very reassuring for the country. So yes, the decisions depend really on the risk there is, and we talk to committees about and get expert advice really about the way we're going to push that forward, but it's tremendously important. Yes.
Yeah, and I think we're evaluating different media platforms to reach our audience all the time as as social media platforms change, get more popular. Traditional methods may be less effective today than they maybe were in the past. So you mentioned things like letters are sent out, dear healthcare professional communications. I think we're recognizing now that sort of paper in envelopes being posted to doctors around the country is less effective than having a pop-up on their prescribing system that reminds them of a warning. So we're sort of moving away from the traditional paper, which is very costly as well, into a more intuitive electronic systems. So yeah, things are ever changing there, and like I said, there will be a whole session on risk communications, looking at some of these issues. But I think social media, particularly when trying to reach the public is going to be increasingly our go-to platform in the future, probably.
Yes, particularly for the younger population, I would say. And I think we're also aware when we're issuing our communications not to overburden health professionals with lots and lots and lots and lots of communication, because then they just get not blasé, but they get immune to the messages that are coming across. So it's quite important to target those messages.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the next question sort of follows on from that, around just a bit more on the understanding of how we use professional bodies, maybe not just in communications, but I think the question is primarily around how we use professional bodies when communicating.
Okay, well, in terms of the professional bodies, we reach out to the heads of the professional bodies, and we have experts from various interests. So we have expert advisory groups, which are largely in terms of therapeutic area. So for instance, we have a cardiovascular, diabetes, renal expert advisory group, allergy group together, where we gather together a network of people that can be our experts. And then those experts will say to us, well, actually, I'm an immunologist, but maybe I'm not the person to talk about this particular aspect. So I know someone else who's in research, and I will reach out to him. So we reach our networks out like that in terms of getting advice. And of course, because we have our structured committees, we're able to get written advice from people. So as well, sometimes it's difficult to get the healthcare professionals. We also like to get patient advocates, and also nurses onto things. But it's actually quite interesting and key to find out what's going on in clinical practice. And sometimes we can be a little bit in an ivory tower when we're in regulation. We don't really know what's going on the ground, and that is a really quite difficult thing to get to grips with. But when we reach out to lots of professional bodies, I think that is the most. I don't know, Mick, can you think of any other ways that we get the experts involved?
Well, expert advice again is going to be covered, but I think we use professional bodies in a number of ways to try and get experts onto committees and to get advice, as you said. But I think also we use professional bodies when communicating the information to make sure that we hitting the right channels to get to their membership. We often use the professional bodies as a postal service sometimes, to say, can you communicate this to your membership, so that we're reaching them more effectively. I think we also use professional bodies to at the beginning of the pharmacovigilance process as well. So we would use professional bodies to help us with developing training programs for undergraduates. So we use the Royal Pharmaceutical Society a lot for understanding how we can train pharmacists in pharmacovigilance and in how to report, so on and so forth. And we also use the professional bodies to kind of get messages out around the importance of engagement with the yellow card scheme for reporting. So we're very much in contact with, in regular communication with professional bodies for a whole host of reasons, from beginning to end. If we think of pharmacovigilance as a journey, an end-to-end process that starts with reporting and ends with a communication on a regulatory action, we have touch points all the way along that journey, I think.
Yeah, I think I could think of the example, for instance, of e-cigarettes, and there was the e-cigarette and vaping acute lung injury issue in the States, which was an endemic, was massive, and we wanted to monitor that here. So we reached out and to all the sort of respiratory physicians, intensivists, pediatric consultants, and as part of that, we asked them to make sure that when they were examining patients and GPs, to ask the patients actually about vaping, so that we could gather that information and that we could help assess whether it was happening here. So and actually they were extremely engaged and very formative about the whole process. And then, you know, to talk about, well, if it's going to happen here, maybe we will start some research. In the end, it didn't, so we didn't need to. We didn't really get the cases in, but we had all that in process. And actually, I think the more you engage, the more and collaborate, the more kind of enthusiasm and the better you do along the way. Definitely, I'd say.
That example reminded me of something that I was thinking about when you were going through your talk, when you talked about understanding the product, and it strikes me that we can't understand every product, every disease area, you know, to a level of expertise that might be required. So using professional bodies, using that expertise, that, you know, having a network of people that we can call upon is really important to us as a regulator, because we can't know every product inside out.
I mean, sometimes
we might know the product, but we might not know the treatment area.
Well, this is it. I mean, sometimes, like recently, we received a communication from a healthcare professional who was concerned that the differences between calcium gluconate and calcium chloride, they're, you know, essentially a calcium salt, but one is 3 times weaker in a way than the other in the ways it's formulated. So you need to give 10 mils of calcium chloride and 30 mils of calcium gluconate. And the concern was that healthcare professionals didn't know the difference. And so therefore patients were being underdosed and at risk of cardiac arrest. And it's difficult because when I looked in our database, we didn't have any reports of this. So then we engaged with the NHS to say, have you had things that we don't know about? So we go across to that. And then we're actually going to investigate the thing forward. But we wouldn't have known about that at all had this healthcare professional not brought it up. And when we looked at it, in fact, it was being used off-label for hyperkalemia, which is not even licensed for, but it's been used since the 1950s. And so some of these issues are very tricky because, you know, what is clinical guideline and what is the regulator's position? But working between the two of us, maybe we can enhance some communication so that the patients are safe.
Absolutely. Just going back to vaccines, we've got maybe more of a comment than a question, but around vaccine misinformation and distrust of vaccines. And I think the comment from a colleague from Ethiopia is around the safety profiles of the vaccines needing to be made available to kind of counter this misinformation that's circulating, I think, predominantly on social media. But the regulator, Ali, I think, has a vital role in combating that misinformation by making available the assessment reports, the safety data, the anything that we are able to publish, I think, should be published to put confidence in the public that they can trust in these products. What do you think?
Definitely. I mean, obviously the patient information leaflets and healthcare professional leaflets are there as a backdrop. But as you say, we publish the data of the reports coming in. We're transparent about what we're doing about it, and whether we think there's a risk or not. We're clear in the information that we give, because, you know, if there's you know, the way that we actually communicate our confidence is key as well. And, you know, it is obviously a major problem, vaccine hesitancy, and in certain groups where that might actually be more at risk than other groups. Black and ethnic minority groups in the UK tend to be a lot more reticent. So we're reaching out to community leaders. I mean, they are very, very important. People in the community are the people that are trusted, and, you know, it's not always a top-down government thing that can help. I mean, we do what we can do and we're transparent in what we do, but we also need to engage with the people on the ground who can influence And you know, the president of Ghana picture that I showed was him saying, you know what, I have confidence in this vaccine, I'm willing to take it myself, go ahead and take it, you know, it's going to help. And I think those sort of media opportunities are very, very important as well.
Yeah, and we're seeing that around the world where, you know, leaders are having their vaccines live on TV, and I think it does go a long way to assure the public. And as you said, in this country, there is maybe a more hesitant population in Black and Asian ethnic groups, and there's been a big push from community leaders up to a TV advert from famous people from those communities encouraging people to take the vaccine.
Footballers, these kind of, you know, profile papers,
TV chefs, you know, all putting the message across. And I think that's been quite successful, actually. I think we've seen the uptake levels really outstrip what we expected.
Yeah, I think we have. And I think that gets back to the slide that I was saying about knowing your population and where they are in terms of how they perceive risk, because then you know how to target it more. Yeah, and you know, I think, as I say, engagement with people on the ground, you know, is the best way, because it's the community within. It's the same with you know, monitoring the rates of infection. You know, public health on the ground is the most important aspect of doing that. When you try to do it from a top down too much, the system falls apart slightly. So it's getting everybody involved, I think.
Yeah, I think if people are mindful of vaccines, they're also probably mindful of government, and the message needs to be coming from people that they, you know, have more respect for and listen to more. Yeah,
church leaders.
Exactly.
It's interesting, isn't it, that, you know, also areas where disease is, a certain disease is very, very prevalent. So in Bangladesh, for instance, the uptake of vaccines in Bangladesh, not of COVID vaccines, but in general, are absolutely phenomenal, because they've seen what it's like to have their children die of childhood illness. Whereas in places like the US and France and here, maybe to a certain extent, there has been no recognition of patients with measles. So for them, they might listen to a bit more of the hesitancy arguments, and the anti-establishment type populist arguments. And so there is always the constant fight against that. But you know, it's interesting to just sort of drill down into various parts of the population and parts of your country that you can focus on, I think.
Yeah, and these there are aspects of this conversation that have taken place with the countries in the AU3S program as they roll out their immunisation programs alongside the MedSafety app for collecting adverse event reports. So a lot of consideration has been given to how to communicate best. So, you know, this is well recognised, I think. We haven't got any more questions to pick up. I think I've exhausted the thoughts that came to my mind. So if anyone has any further questions, please drop them in the box now, so we can pick them up. Ali, is there anything else you wanted to mention before we sign off today?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think this has been a really, really kind of groundbreaking week in terms of rollout of vaccines in Africa, which is just amazing. So I'm just honoured to be able to talk to you today. And I know that a lot of the things that I've said might not be directly applicable to you, but there might be things that you can draw from this and take forward into your own practice, because you're the best person on the ground to know what you can do. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sally. And just as an assurance to folks on the call and who will pick this up, because we record all of these sessions and quite often picked up afterwards, that the MHRA is very much invested in this program and remain at the disposal of the people working in the countries that the AU3S program is focused on, and we're here to support. So if things come up after the event from these sessions, we'd be happy to pick that up.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. A question has just come in. We do have a little bit of time. So it's from Yvonne, who says, please elaborate on press interest. So, well, maybe I'll start, and then Ali, you can pick up. So in the UK, I think this is true to a degree in a lot of countries, but I think in the UK, maybe more than many, our press are quite sensationalist, and they like to create stories, often where there are none. And I think they've been very good with COVID, where they've been very supportive of the immunisation programme. They've been very supportive of the role of the MHRA and the government's position as a whole with regard to vaccines. But that can change very quickly. And I think as the MHRA, it's our responsibility to make sure that we are in constant communication with the press, being very transparent over our role and the data that we have, because we know that the press has a key role in communicating that to the public. And the more we can have the press communicate the positive messages that are coming out from around the vaccine, around its safety, around its efficacy, around encouragement to have the vaccine, and present the safety data in that proportionate way that Ali, you were sort of referring to, I think is really important. So we've had to do quite a lot of work around the press. We had an issue in the UK where we were actually delayed quite a bit in publishing our safety information. We were very keen to get it out there because of those very reasons, but we had to get a lot of things sort of lined up before we could publish, and that took some weeks to get to where we wanted to be. But we're very keen that longer we delayed in publishing safety information, the risk of the press thinking there was something untoward and that we were suppressing or hiding the safety information is something that we were very concerned about. So it's a fine balance, keeping them on side and running the risk of them flipping and being sensationalist. So I think we've done okay with COVID vaccine. We haven't always done okay with vaccines as a whole. There's been a lot of scare stories around vaccines, going back to MMR and, the autism stories that were really picked up in the press, really did damage to MMR vaccinations. So it's a tightrope that we walk with this one.
It is, and we have kind of a press preparedness kind of plan. We have lines to take ready for if we get a press release, and we think very carefully about the way we format those messages. So we try to be proactive as opposed to reactive, because that's difficult. We also have for the vaccines, we have one of us on call 24 hours a day, every day, so that actually, we can never be accused of being not responding to queries as soon as they come in. And if we have kind of a horizon scanning attitude as well, to sort of see what might potentially be issues out there for various things. As Mick says, we've done okay so far, but we don't rest on our laurels, because it's absolutely devastating if the press takes something out of context, or tries to get a story that will damage the vaccination program. I mean, at the moment, we're doing okay, but we very much are conservative about our pleasure in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Sally, and thanks to everyone on the webinar for your attention this morning. As always, we have a poll for you to complete. This helps us design future sessions in response to your feedback. So this is really important for us. So if you can take the time to fill out just these 4 or 5 questions, that will really help us. So we'll close now. Thanks again, Ali, and we look forward to the next session, which is this week after next, I believe. We'll see you then.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day. Thank you.